Good afternoon. My name is Joseph Figueras, and you are?
Dimitra Fontelli.
Welcome to this webinar that we are doing in collaboration with the Swedish Presidency of the European Union, and in particular, Malin Grape, the ambassador, the AMR ambassador, who will be talking to you later. So we had the privilege to put this webinar together. What is the topic today? I hope if you join, you know the topic already, but let me say it anyway. How can the EU support sustainable innovation and access to effective antibiotics? Why is that important? And I know, sorry to go through the basics, but I think we need to remind ourselves why it's such an important issue. First, as you'll hear in much more detail by the experts, the pipeline of new antibiotics is dry, but as worrying, the access to old antibiotics seems to be threatened as well. So how do we access old antibiotics and new antibiotics? What are kinds of incentives we can put in place? And what is the role of the EU with its member states in doing that? If there is an area that no one can counter-argue, even those less happy with the role of the EU, is that AMR, it's a public good. AMR is not about subsidiarity. AMR cross borders. And so it does as well the kinds of measures that we have to put in place to tackle AMR. And part of that is very much the issue of the accessing to new antibiotics. So that's the second element. The third element, which excites me in particular, and perhaps is not something that we would agree with others, is that it seems to me that the discussion today has enormous implications for working together on the access of pharmaceutical innovations, technological innovations at the EU level. There is clearly an element of us in the EU working together as a public good to access to some innovations. And it seems to me that the lessons from this particular experience can be very much applicable to other areas. But you'll tell me at the end, or throughout the process, we'll have lots of opportunity to hear your views online. So the Swedish Presidency, and Malin will talk about that in a minute, has made this issue of access to antibiotics for AMR as one of the key priorities, as they did actually in the last presidency. So for the observatory, it's been a real privilege to work with them and help the presidency, well, rather than helping, working together with the presidency to try to collect best evidence, existing evidence, best practice about how we tackle this issue. And in particular, and this is the core today, is what are the kinds of options, mechanisms, or strategies as to what the EU can do together, how member states can do together in this public good to address this challenge. The observatory is not normative, so we are not here to tell you what should happen. We're here to tell you, together with the presidency, these are the options, these are the pros and cons of the various options. So again, many thanks to Malin Grape, many thanks to the EU Presidency for working on that together. Many thanks to you, Dimitra Fontelli, Michael Anderson, who will be speaking in a minute about the work, and indeed, Professor Elias Mosialos, who have been working in this work. But also very important for me to thank the reference group. We're very lucky to count with the great and the good in validating, in questioning, in strengthening the quality of that work. So we had there the EU, various directors there, the WHO, we had HEMA, of course, we had HERA, and we had EMA, HERA, and the OECD, among many other organizations that they were looking at that work. But as the English say, the proof is in the pudding. So it's no point for me to say how wonderful we are and how great is that. In a minute, you have access to that policy brief, so you're able to judge that. And you'll hear from us about that work, but much more importantly, that the evidence is what's going to happen, what's the way forward. So in the first instance, Michael Anderson, as I said, one of the authors of this work, will be presenting in short what this work is about, and hopefully that become an incentive for you to click and download that work. Then we'll hear from Malin Grape, and we'll be able to ask her what are the recommendations of the Swedish Presidency in this field, key key. I don't think they go to council conclusions, but even if they don't go there, we'll hear from Malin. These are very important recommendations for the EU and the member states as to the access to antibiotics. Then we're particularly pleased to have also Roger Domenech, Director of One Health at the Commission, and she'll take not only the issues of access to antibiotics, but as importantly, from the One Health perspective, Roger indeed, to give a sense how we tackle the broader issue of antimicrobial resistance. And then finally, last but not least, Kees de Jonker, Senior Advisor to the WHO and former head of the Pharmaceuticals Program, is going to tell us a bit, give us some reflection from the WHO perspective, because indeed, the WHO with its member states, which includes the EU, has an important role to play in this field. But before all of that, we're very grateful to the Swedish Minister of Health to support that initiative. This initiative was presented in the last ministerial conference, to be here in the form of a video to introduce all that. And then Dimi will continue with the facilitation and the presentations that we have in store for you. Remember, please give us comments. We will include those. We will analyze those in the chat and bring those back to the debate and to the panelists. Thank you very much. So we'll hear first from the Minister of Health.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished participants, the Swedish Presidency of the Council of the European Union is coming to an end. During these 6 months, one of our priorities has been to address the challenges of antimicrobial resistance, the AMR. Our focus has been to highlight the matter of ensuring sustainable access to effective antibiotics, as well as the EU's contribution to counteracting AMR on a global level. Given the nature of the problem, collaboration between stakeholders is important. In line with this, the Swedish Presidency has joined forces with leading actors, the European Observatory on Health Systems and Policies being one of these. Therefore, I am grateful for this opportunity to wrap up the Presidency activities on AMR. First of all, I want to highlight the high-level meeting on AMR hosted by the Swedish Presidency in the beginning of March. The meeting focused on sustainable access to existing and stimulation of the development of new antibiotics, as well as how the EU can contribute to efforts at global level. Here I want to especially mention the policy brief developed by the European Observatory on Health System and Policies, focusing on how the EU can support sustainable innovation and access to effective antibiotics. The policy brief indeed contributed to a very successful high-level meeting, and I want to express my deepest gratitude to the European Observatory on Health Systems and Policies for all your commitment, expertise, and not least, all the hard work. Secondly, I want to mention the illustrative model of the antibiotic research and development and the access chain and its challenges that has been developed by the Presidency with support from REACT and Uppsala University. The model was presented in connection to the high-level meeting on AMR and will be further demonstrated in this webinar by Sweden's ambassador on antimicrobial resistance, Dr. Malin Grape. The ambition of the Swedish Presidency is that this model, together with the policy brief, will help further discussions and support the development, understanding, and analysis of upcoming proposals and initiatives in the pharmaceutical area. Thirdly, I also want to highlight the Council recommendations on stepping up EU action to combat antimicrobial resistance in a One Health approach. The Presidency worked hard to conclude the negotiations on the recommendation in the Council. And I am happy to say that last week the recommendation was adopted by health ministers at the EPSCO meeting. It is truly remarkable that through this recommendation, for the first time ever, targets at EU level are set for AMR, antimicrobial consumption, and antimicrobial resistance in human health. Through these actions, my hope is that the Swedish Presidency has contributed to nuancing and deepening the understanding of the matter of AMR. this complex, multifaceted issue characterized by a non-functioning market logic and what is necessary to address it. Ladies and gentlemen, and distinguished participants, finally, I want to underline that despite initiatives and efforts, the current pace is insufficient. Unless the global response is substantially intensified, many more lives are put in danger. Global actions is therefore urgent. The input received during these presidency months sends a clear message. AMR is a political priority for the European Union member states. The European Union, through its member states and institutions, are ready to take the next necessary steps to leverage global progress on AMR together with partner countries and organizations. We are looking forward to contributing to the future work on AMR at EU level under the leadership of upcoming presidencies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Forsmet, for your support and your leadership. Dear colleagues, we are now moving to the slightly more technical part of the webinar, and we will hear, as Josep mentioned earlier, from Michael Anderson, first author of the policy brief, about the key findings from the work behind it, both towards stimulating the innovation and research and development into new antibiotics, but also ensuring that we have consistent, broad access to existing antibiotics. So Michael, I would like to invite you to take the stage, and also thank you very much from my side for all the work you put into this. Over to you.
Great, thank you. So my name is Michael Anderson. I'm a technical officer at the European Observatory on Health Systems and Policies, and also a research fellow at the London School of Economics. I had the privilege of working on this policy brief with colleagues at the European Observatory. So the policy brief focused on 4 key questions. So what are the major challenges across the research and development pathway for antibiotics? What challenges exist to ensure sustainable supply of new and pre-existing antibiotics? What actions can be taken at the EU level to stimulate R&D of new antibiotics? And how can the EU promote sustainable and timely access to pre-existing and new antibiotics once developed and approved? So I'm going to give you a brief overview of the content of the policy brief. It's a 70-page brief. So I encourage you to look at the document as well to explore some of the themes that I'm going to highlight today. So thinking about some of the major challenges in the R&D pathway for antibiotics. So the WHO publishes a review of the pipeline each year, and there are new antibiotics that are coming to market. So that's important to acknowledge. But the issue is that many of these new antibiotics don't have innovative characteristics, and they're quite vulnerable to developing cross-resistance. So the WHO has described the clinical antibiotic as insufficient to meet the challenges of antibiotic resistance. However, it's important to acknowledge that there are actually some quite innovative molecules in the preclinical pipeline that are struggling to be pushed forward into the clinical pipeline. So why is this the case? Well, there are particular scientific challenges, for example, with gram-negative bacteria and their protective outer membrane, that mean that it's very challenging to develop effective, safe molecules. And when I mean safe for human consumption. So as a result, the transition probabilities between each stage of development mean that if an antibiotic is at the preclinical stage, it only has a 3% likelihood of actually reaching the market. And this, combined with market challenges such as low sale volumes and price competition with pre-existing generics, mean that the return on investment for R&D in antibiotics is actually negative once you bring it to the market. So as a result, nearly all large pharmaceutical companies have withdrawn from investing in R&D. Once the new antibiotic reaches markets, because of some of the issues I mentioned earlier, you'll find that developers prioritize the larger markets where they're more likely to get a reasonable return on investment from their investment in commercialization and launch of the drug. So when the new antibiotic comes to market, we can see that there's inconsistent access amongst member states. So despite being careful where they market the drugs to limit their exposure to losses, we still find that many antibiotic developers declare bankruptcy post-launch. And when looking at pre-existing antibiotics, we see a number of issues. So first of all, there are widespread shortages. So in the last year, for example, there have been thousands of shortages reported for phenoxypenicillin and amoxicillin amidst a wave of respiratory infections in children. And what we see a vulnerable and fragile supply chain, and this is because of two main issues. So the active pharmaceutical ingredients used to produce generic antibiotics are often sourced from single suppliers that have had to achieve large economies of scale to return profits. And these are based predominantly in China and India. And if there's an issue with one of these suppliers, it can cause global shortages. And then past the phase where the active pharmaceutical ingredient is produced, we find that the generic manufacturers have also had to merge into large organizations. So there is only a small number of generic manufacturers. So we see a lack of diversification of the manufacturing supply. Alongside this, we also see that many older antibiotics that now would be of significant public health value because they can be used against resistant pathogens have been withdrawn from markets because historically they were used in small volumes. So taking stock of all of these challenges that are impacting the supply and development of antibiotics, we drew upon a framework that we've developed to assess the suitability of incentive options to stimulate the R&D of new antibiotics. And this uses a set of principles. So speaking very broadly, so the public health factors are concerned with incentivizing the development of new antibiotics that address high priority medical need. So that's where the resistant infections cause the most significant health burden in terms of mortality and morbidity. Also designing incentives that encourage the conservation of those new antibiotics when they come to market. So they encourage stewardship and infection prevention control, and manufacturing processes that limit the exposure of antibiotics to the environment. And then the market factors are to do with ensuring that there is an increase in a return on investment for antibiotic developers to incentivize investment from industry, the private sector, and also to ensure that developers remain commercially viable, and also encourage the participation of small and medium enterprises, which drive most of the development of antibiotics. And from an implementation perspective, it's important to consider the appropriate size of incentive when it's delivered at the different stages of research and development to make sure we can push those innovative preclinical compounds through to clinical development. And also, how can we govern the package and ensure that there's coordination with other international initiatives that are using different push and pull incentives. So in the brief, we focus on 6 incentive options that have been proposed by the Commission and also member states and analysed in the literature. So these can be broadly classified according to whether they're direct financial pull incentives. So these are subscription payments or annual revenue guarantees, or market entry awards. And this is where the size of incentive can be directly altered according to the public health value of the antibiotic. Then there's indirect financial pull incentives, which are regulatory interventions such as transferable exclusivity extensions or market exclusivity extensions that will work to improve the amount of revenues that an antibiotic developer would get once they bring an antibiotic to market, but there is some uncertainty associated with the financial cost of these incentives. Then the other incentive options we looked at were milestone payments that were issued following the completion of different stages of development, and also the options model for antibiotic, which provides a mechanism to share risk in antibiotic research and development and improve return on investment. Now, alongside looking at those incentive options, we undertook a review of publicly available data on investments in push incentives for antibiotic research and development. This analysis was undertaken with colleagues from Carbex, who we're very grateful for their input in helping us source this various data, including from their respective data sets. But the big picture we see when looking at the projected investments in push incentives over the next 10 years is that there is a significant gap in early stage product development, so between the preclinical and phase 1 clinical trials. And we emphasize at the brief that whilst the focus is currently on pull incentives at the EU level, there is still a need for push incentives to bridge this gap, particularly after the conclusion of the Enable programme, which yet has a, whilst there is a successor to the Enable programme, Enable 2, funded by the Swedish government, there is no commitment to Enable 2 from the European Commission. Now, alongside looking at R&D into new antibiotics, we looked at some of the drivers of lack of availability of pre-existing antibiotics, and most of the literature points to financial considerations and the fragility of the antibiotic supply chain. And we explore a number of policy options that can be broadly categorized according to whether they're regulatory levers, such as the abolishment or reducing of annual registration fees for new antibiotics, or the modification of sunset clauses, which mean that they're withdrawn from market if they're not launched within a certain period of time or used within a certain period of time. Also allowing re-registration of older antibiotics using old data and harmonizing packaging and leafleting information. And from the purchasing perspective, we looked at options such as using subscription payments and annual revenue guarantees for older antibiotics, as well as joint purchasing between member states. And then from the intelligence gathering and strengthening perspective, we looked at potential opportunities to map antibiotic suppliers and inventories across Europe, and the use of virtual and physical stockpiling to ensure that stockpiles of antibiotics can be rapidly redeployed to member states when they experience shortages. So just taking stock of what we learned throughout the process, whilst the mandate of the brief was very much to focus on the EU perspective, we acknowledge throughout that this is not just an EU level problem, and the EU needs to carefully think about how it can coordinate with other initiatives by the G7, G20 countries, for example, and crucially thinking about how the EU can support access to essential antibiotics in low and middle income countries, which is a major driver of resistance if suboptimal and broad spectrum antibiotics are being used in place of generic antibiotics with lower resistance potential. So with that final thought, that brings my presentation to a close, and I'd just like to express my gratitude to the European Observatory and also the Swedish Presidency for inviting me to be part of this work.
Thank you very much, Michael. This was clear and to the point. I think perhaps to mention that there is a link to the policy brief in the chat box. And just to also clarify, or a little teaser, Michael was asked to do the impossible, present an entire brief, a quite long brief for that in 10 minutes. So if you go into the brief, you will see that we go through the different layers for each of these incentives or mechanisms, of what criteria from the framework that Michael presented they address, but also how operational they are and what the challenges might be. So this was a teaser, Michael's presentation, and my teaser now is to ask you to go into the brief for more information. But as we heard from Giuseppe and from Minister Forsman, the brief fed into a meeting, the high-level meeting on AMR under the Swedish Presidency of the Council of the EU, where we had broader discussions that included also additional components during the meeting, but also the presidency itself after the meeting discussed further and deliberated further. And we have Malin Grabbe with us, who will reflect a bit on what you learned and what you take away as the presidency nears its end. Malin, over to you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here and to present this brief, which I'm so glad to having been able to collaborate with you on. So as you heard, Sweden has had a long-standing commitment to AMR on the highest political level. We did highlight AMR in our previous presidency in 2009, and it was early very clear for us that we would like to highlight AMR again and put it on the top of the agenda for this presidency. And I think looking back to 2009, I believe that we have seen a lot of progress, not the least on the EU level, where we have a lot of structures and ongoing work. On the other hand, I think we also, and I think I share this with many of you participating today, a certain frustration of not seeing more concrete progress. We still have this pipeline crisis, for example. We still suffer from failing access to key antibiotics in our health systems. So when starting to plan for this work for the presidency, we very early saw that there's no need right now to come up with to invent new creative ideas about how to solve these issues, but rather to take a good look at the abundance of work already done, the many suggested options already on the table. And this is, I'm so glad to see that this policy brief really reflected this. And as you heard, we used this policy brief both for the high-level meeting, but also for a dedicated expert meeting on this specific issue of access to existing antibiotics and stimulation of development of new antibiotics. And I think it was really inspiring to see how member states and other participants in the meeting, different institutions like WHO, for example, came together and really, looked at it from this more comprehensive way. So I would like to share with you now this illustration that the minister mentioned. And this was a way for us to illustrate that this is not a linear process, that it's the development of new antibiotics is also interconnected with the access to both new and existing antibiotics and the monitoring of the use. And as long as we use antibiotics, we will also continue to have resistance development, meaning that we will have to reiterate the priority setting. So this might look a bit complicated, but we use this illustration as a basis for the discussions in the expert meeting. So what we did was to use the policy brief with the identified challenges along this chain. And we had really good discussions of possible solutions and possible measures to meet all these weaknesses and challenges along this chain. I will show you, not for you to really go into the details, but more as an illustration of how intense the discussions were, how productive the discussions were. So the dark blue boxes here are the identified challenges that we put on the table for discussion, and the light blue boxes are all the suggestions that came from the experts during this meeting. And these are, some of these are really, and also reflected a lot what's in the policy brief. But some of these are of course very ambitious and really demands the entire EU, and sometimes maybe also beyond EU, that we come together and decide on specific measures. Some of these are also a bit more low-hanging fruit. Some of this can be done nationally, though preferably in collaboration and experience exchange and exchange of best practices. But I think the most important outcome and conclusion from this discussion was, of course, that there is not one single solution to the pipeline crisis and the access crisis of effective antibiotics. but rather we have to take an end-to-end approach. I'm convinced that we will need a comprehensive package of different measures to meet the challenges along this chain, and obviously this is something that we have to do together. So I will take this away now. If you're interested in looking more deeply into this, you can use this QR code to find this published material, and we can also share it in the chat during this webinar. So this was then one part of this high-level meeting. The other part, as Minister Forssmed also mentioned, was a discussion on how the EU can contribute to global progress on AMR. And these two areas are, of course, also very much interlinked, because what EU does when it comes to access and the development of new antibiotics also, of course, affects the rest of our world. And we don't only need, of course, access within the EU, but we need much better access globally, and especially, of course, in low and middle income countries. I'm sorry if there's noise behind me. I'm currently connecting with you from Washington, so I'm sitting in my hotel room early morning here. I hope the sound is okay anyway. So what I wanted to say with this is also that of course, the discussions on the EU's contribution to global progress, there are ongoing processes like the negotiations of a pandemic instrument, where the EU is also working to include reflection of the AMR challenges within this instrument. And another, of course, very important process is the preparations now for the high-level meeting in the UN General Assembly in 2024. There is quite some time left, but I think we really have to step up and work together now. And it was very clear from this high-level meeting that the EU leaders are ready to work together, that the EU should speak with one voice, but that it's also really important for us to partner with other stakeholders in other countries and regions in order to lead the way to ambitious commitments during this meeting and in the political declaration of this meeting. So finally, I will just also reiterate our gratitude for the cooperation both with the European Observatory Health Systems and Policies for this work, but also just want to mention the Council recommendations and the cooperation of all the member states. I'm really, really glad to see the ambitions from the member states and the adoption of these Council recommendations. I think they very much reflect a lot of what was brought up during the high-level meeting. We're really happy to see, for example, the willingness to commit to specific and measurable targets. And I think this gives me a lot of hope, and I feel quite optimistic when it comes to also the global work that we have ahead of us. So thank you very much for now, and I look forward to listening to the remaining speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Malin, for all these different facets. I think the chain that you showed and all the different challenges and all the different steps that would need to be taken is really important, I think, for everyone. We are aware, but it reiterates the message that AMR is very complicated. Antibiotics availability and innovation is by far not the only thing that we should be doing. But even if we only look at this one thing, there's so many things that we need to be aware of and we need to tackle and we need to take action on. So this explains perhaps also the complications and the difficulties of actually reaching actionable points. And I think you put it very, very well. But we're now at a situation or at a point at the juncture where we see hope for actionable points and commitment moving forward. And we will return to this a bit later in the webinar. So thank you very much. You also highlighted the different levels of action from the Commission, from the EU side. And to discuss this a bit more, we have Rosaire, as Giuseppe mentioned earlier, joining us. Rosaire, the director for One Health, so even very, very fitting for this broader perspective that Malin also brought in. So I come to you for your insights on the Commission's work on AMR. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dini. And I will start already with trying to share. Tell me, can you see it?
Yes, we see it. It's perfect. Continue.
Perfect. So thank you very much. Thank you very much to the Swedish Presidency and the Observatory for having me today in this event. I'm only sorry that my colleagues who have been very actively contributing to your excellent policy brief could not be here today. And in particular, those that were more involved and dealing very specifically also with the pharma legislation. I've just been appointed, very recently, as Dini was saying, a director for One Health. So I have among my responsibilities AMR. So my presentation necessarily will be general. I think that flowing a bit from what the minister and Malin explained. So I'll start with the very, very long, more than at least 20 years of action against AMR by the Commission and in the EU. This has been ongoing, though I would say that it has been a real political priority since the previous Commission mandate. And our Commissioner, Stella Kyriakides, was given a very clear mandate by President von der Leyen on the fight against AMR, and in particular also internationally. So our action has been much bolder in the last few years, not least because it was also sort of impulsed by the situation created by the pandemic. But just to mention a couple of quite important actions, which are here we're talking a lot about public health, but as you know, the animal health area is very important. And one of the things that we've done in the context of our farm to fork strategy is precisely to aim at reducing by 50% the sales of antibiotics in farmed animals and aquaculture, and also the ban of antimicrobials used for growth promotion or yield increase in animals. And on the human side, no need to explain, because it's been already mentioned, the pharma legislation, including prudent use and proposals for both pull and push incentives, and the Council recommendation, which, by the way, Malin mentioned the Presidency and the Member States, but let's not forget it was the Commission who presented it. So it's a point d'honneur, as we say in French. And of course, we are extremely happy about the importance that and the priority that the Presidency has given to this file, which has allowed us to really go through it in record time. I mean, my Director General could not believe how quickly it was negotiated. Very quickly, the Council recommendation is about stepping up key action on, obviously, national action plans, surveillance and monitoring, infection prevention and control, stewardship and prudent use, awareness and education, and obviously research and development, none of which is obviously strange to you all. But maybe the most visible part of the Council recommendation was precisely the targets that Malin was also referring to. Basically, by 2030, the idea, and these were targets that we developed together with the ECDC. The main ones is the reduction, the 20% reduction of the total consumption of antibiotics in humans in the EU, at least that 65% of the total consumption of antibiotics in humans should be of the so-called antibiotics from the access group, those that have lower potential for the development of antimicrobial resistance. And then obviously targets also for the reduction of infections of 3 key antibiotic resistant bacteria. Very quick word on funding, since this is quite a good leverage also for EU action. 2 main programs, as you probably know, one being Horizon Europe for research and development, and another the EU for Health. And EU for Health, as you know, used to be a relatively small program of 400 million, and now it has in 5 years more than 5 billion, of which the AMR actions are also stepping up. And one of it is the joint action that is being prepared to be launched next year with member states, and the idea is to support the national action plans, improve surveillance, upgrade obviously the infection prevention and control measures, and foster prudent use of antimicrobials, in addition to rolling out awareness raising campaigns in the member states. We are ourselves being very proactive on communication and supporting member states in their efforts, since this is quite an important file. We've seen in the last Eurobarometer we published last year that knowledge about antibiotics and how to use antibiotics is still far from good. And a very last word, which was also referred to, is obviously the global action. And our global action, which has been definitely also stepped up in the last years, and which positions the global health as a key, as an essential pillar of the EU external policy. We are still seeing sometimes how our ambassadors are a bit surprised when we are dealing with issues, including the pandemic agreement. Malin mentioned it, pandemic agreement or accord, or whatever the final name will take, which is currently being negotiated, hopefully to be concluded by May next year. Malin mentioned the UN high-level conference next year as well. We are being very, very proactive in several fora, and in particular in G7 and G20. I mean, I can obviously expand this a bit more later, and also, but also, of course, with several international organizations, and in the context of the quadripartite, but also in our bilateral relations with third countries. Japan not only being the presidency of the G7, but also a very important partner of us. We are just trying to negotiate a common statement for the high-level meeting that will take place in July, and one prominent part is going to be on AMR. I don't know if this was within my 10 minutes. I think I will stop here and maybe then come back later. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Rosa. And yes, you were within your 10 minutes, excellent timekeeping. And I think given the range of initiatives and the multiplicity of levers, this was really a big accomplishment that you managed it in such a short time. we land here on the last slide from Rosé on the global action, and so we link perhaps a bit swiftly in the interest of time to our next speaker, Kees de Jonker from the WHO, to talk to us about how the WHO engages in that area. Clearly, the need for stakeholder collaboration, already pointed out by Minister Forsman in the very beginning, has permeated every presentation so far. So Kees, we come to you. Just from my side, just a piece of information for our viewers. Our panelists are really engaged and they joined us from everywhere today. So they changed their schedules while they were traveling. So we had Malin from Washington, we have Rosé during a really busy time for the Commission, and we have Kees from Belgrade, I believe, Kees, who is at another meeting, but still found time to come and join us. So Kees, over to you. We can't see you due to traveling technical issues, but hopefully we can still hear you, and you give us a short reflection about what the WHO is doing. Thank you, and over to you.
Yeah. Yes, thank you very much. And indeed, sorry, I cannot be, with you directly. And so you have to just do it with my voice. So I'm temporarily working again with WHO. I retired a few years ago, but re-engaging again with the European office on a temporary basis. And with my other hat on, I was also the chair of the Netherlands Antibiotics Development Platform, hence my great interest in this area. I'm stepping in for Sarah Garner, who is working with the WHO in the European office, who has at the same time another commitment, but she was very happy to join for the reference group for this great product that the Swedish Presidency, together with the Observatory, has produced. So thank you very much for that. I think it's very welcome, and it just shows the continued importance and priority that we're putting on this topic. I just want to make to stress a couple of points, because I think all the important things have already been said. On the push side for new antibiotics, I think we do see that there has been a lot of new money going into the development and discovery of new antibiotics. At the same time, we do see that the pipeline continues to be insufficient to really address the major challenges that we have in that area. So more will be needed in that respect. Rightly so, the report also reviews some of the pull mechanisms. I think we have been, over the last 20 years, I think we have reviewed all the options, as previous speakers has already been said. But I think, and it's good to see that several countries are actually taking concrete action in that area as well. And I think more will be needed at a larger scale to see how we can develop pull mechanisms that are really pulling new antibiotics through the pipeline. Importantly, and I think in previous efforts, perhaps that was not so present, the report also pays a lot of attention to maintaining older generic antibiotics on the market, because I think from a public health point of view, the risk of losing existing antibiotics is a very real risk. And so I think we do need to harness our systems to ensure that what we have, we actually keep that, and that we keep that active as well. A fourth point I wanted to make that was also rightfully put forward is that where we do develop new antibiotics, we do need to find models where we make those available and accessible worldwide. It cannot be that we're just developing something that would be accessible for high-income countries, but we do need to find the models where the rest of the world would also benefit from that. Let me just point out a few things that we've been doing as WHO, and that is particularly also our colleagues in headquarters. Over the last years, we have identified the priority pathogen list. So those antibiotics for those bacteria for which we know at worldwide that are really where we see the high resistance levels and where we have no therapies available. We have reviewed the WHO essential medicines list and created the AWARE classification, where we look at antibiotics that need to be accessible, the access category. We have the antibiotics where we have resistance issues, where we need to watch them, and we have the reserve antibiotics. So I think that is also important to direct our priorities. It was already referred to the pipeline. Annually, WHO in Geneva is collecting data on what is in the preclinical and clinical pipeline, and we clearly see that there is insufficient innovation coming through at this point in time. So that is something to really look at and intensify our efforts. And then specifically at the level of Europe, we have launched a new initiative in terms of access to novel medicines, the Access to Novel Medicines platform. And this is relates to the concerns that both the middle income, but very much the high income countries in Europe see in accessibility to new medicines and antibiotics, for not getting any new antibiotics, but if we may get them, they may be of high cost as well, is something where we need to look for innovative ways on how we can push this forward. So under the this new initiative, the Access to Novel Medicines platform, we are specifically setting up a working group with member states and with the private partners, both industry as well as patient and professional organizations, to look at new models on how we can develop and make available and accessible new antibiotics. So let me leave it here for the time being. Thank you very much, and congratulations on the initiative.
Thank you very much, Kees, really crucial points. And thank you also for keeping it short, because we're running behind. Everyone had many interesting things to say. And Kees, by the curse of being the last in a sequence of brilliant speakers, your brilliance had to be condensed accordingly. I will just pick out a couple of the things that I see in the chat from our listeners. We won't really have time, as we have to close at 3 o'clock Central European time sharp, to go back in detail, but I think we've heard already a lot that goes towards answering the question. So one of the first points is from Lisa Maria from Finland, saying a lot of the things that we are discussing as challenges are common also for other pharmaceuticals. What are the specificities of antibiotics that make it particularly important to look at or different? And I think in this point, I would say we do make a case in the brief of looking at why these specific challenges are particularly pronounced for antibiotics. The second question that comes clearly across is exactly this idea of a joint pool incentive and how that might look. And I think we heard already from Kees one avenue of discussion with the novel medicines platforms at the WHO level. We heard from Rosé about new joint actions that are coming that will be looking at this. And we heard from Malin about the discussions during the presidency and passing on the baton when it comes to the future priorities. So this is something I think that we still need to discuss quite a bit, and rightly so pointed out by our speakers. There is a final point, which is about thinking towards making production for a global public good public, but I think we would require quite a long and complicated discussion to work around that. I'm sure this will be something that will be on the table for discussions at all these different levels that we just talked about, particularly given the other point that has been permeating all the presentations, which is the importance of actually ensuring that any solutions that we find are applicable worldwide and at the global level, and not only for the countries who are leading the race in that sense. I would like to ask all our panelists to join me by switching on their cameras, except for Kees, unfortunately. And just perhaps a final question for you for one moment, which is hearing all the things you've heard and the inputs from the chat. We know there are good practice examples. Perhaps give us one little flower of hope on how we move forward in the next steps. What can we take as a good example to put on the table and discuss with other stakeholders in future discussions? Michael, I think I asked you to switch on your camera as well. You are the one that's missing so far. And perhaps we start with Malin. I mean, you have already good examples in Sweden. I know that, so maybe you want to bring one of those.
Thank you. Yes, in the interest of time, I could just mention that, of course, we have to do this together. What Sweden has done and very recently concluded was a pilot on a revenue guarantee model. This was aimed for assuring access to already approved antibiotics, but for us being a small and maybe not so interesting market, this has been paramount for the results that we have seen when it comes to access to these antibiotics in Sweden. We hope that this experience can also be used when it comes to scaling up and working together for similar types of collaborations at EU level and globally. Thank you.
Thank you, Malin. I think this links also really well to the point raised in the chat. Michael, can I come to you, and then we go to Jose, finally to Kes, and then back to Giuseppe to close us off.
Yeah, I think just to end on a positive note, I think we should acknowledge that policies are being implemented and developed internationally. So Marlin just mentioned the annual revenue and guarantee in Sweden. There's a subscription model in the UK. There's now a model in Japan. There's talk of a model in the US and Canada. And it's important that the European Commission thinks about how it can just navigate the implementation challenges and the politics. So for Europe to think of a similar model that it can implement at a large scale.
I think this is a loud and clear message, Michael, and perhaps we pass to Jose to agree, I'm assuming.
Yes, absolutely. I was going to say, we not only agree, we are practicing it, we are developing it. Not only our proposal, and which we are obviously currently starting to discuss, but also internationally. And Michael mentioned Japan, but at several levels. And we have not only the like-minded countries, but we have a big challenge internationally. And we hope that we can manage to precisely discuss this at the level of at multilateral level, and more in particular during the pandemic agreement. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jose. Kes, over to you. We have the UNGA coming up in 2024. I'm sure we have things to take with us there.
A ray of hope. I would definitely mention the GARD-P, the Global Antibiotic Research and Development Partnership that was set up in 2016. As WHO, we were involved. They are using a new licensing model. They have launched the Secure initiative in terms of access worldwide. They stress the stewardship principles as well. It is not just making antibiotics available, but also ensure that they are being appropriately prescribed. I think the other important initiative that we haven't talked about yet, but at least good to mention, is the Pasteur Act that in the United States, the pioneering antimicrobial prescriptions to end upsurging resistance act, a massive amount of money that will become available in the US, and that really has the potential to be a game changer as well in this respect. So definitely good prospects to move on, and I'm sure that in next year in the high-level meeting on AMR, all those points will come to the table. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kes. Giuseppe, you're back. Over to you.
Thank you all. Dimi, my brilliance will have to be even shorter than everybody else. So let me give you just 20 seconds in that we really make a point to finish those webinars on time, particularly in a hot summer afternoon in most of the European region at least. Let me say just three things, and then I'll ask Malin whether she's been leading us in this initiative, and now from Washington, to make a few last words. First, all speakers have said, clearly this is not just about accessing to pharmaceuticals and antibiotics, it's about AMR, and there's plenty of evidence about the kinds of strategies Jose did within the One Health initiative. Yes, clearly there's complexity, but there's plenty of evidence, as Michael has shown, about the things that do work. Third, it's not Europe, it's not the European Union, it's Europe with the WHO region, but it's global. It's G7, it's G20. And my worry, having been around for a little bit, is I've been already in 3 EU presidencies discussing the issue of AMR. I don't want to live with a cloud. I'll prefer to say what Kees was saying. There is horizon, there is hope in the horizon, but I do not see enough political will. And I know, thank you, Swedish Presidency, for the leadership. Thank you, the Commission. Thank you, WHO and the researchers. But I like to see more political will. I want to see more regulation. I can say these things because nobody of you can say that. I can say because I'm nobody. Therefore, I can say I would expect much more stick and regulation about this area. Antibiotics, but viruses and other, as well as viruses, bacteria et al. Are crossing borders. We heard that a billion times. Why there's not enough political will to put measures in place that are not rocket science? I would expect much more accountability between member states to each other. I would expect much more regulation because the measures are there. We heard it a million times. This is a pandemic waiting, which was there waiting before the COVID. It's there. If we don't take that very seriously, I'm really extremely worried, and we should be extremely worried. So let's work with our member states, with our policymakers, to make that an issue, because the Swedish Presidency, because the Commission, because WHO and the researchers out there have told us what should be done. So I'll leave it there. I'll pass it to Malin to disagree with me, and you'll see as well a cover now. For those of us who have not heard yet that we have a policy brief, there you are, the website at the cover of the brief. Malin, your last famous words, please. And thank you very much again to you.
Thank you so much. And as you say, yes, we do need more political will, but I think what I heard in the high-level meeting in Stockholm, there is political will. I was really very much optimistic after this meeting to hear the commitment from so many of the participants. From the Swedish side, yes, our presidency will come to an end now, but the commitment remains, and we very much look forward to work together with the Commission. I really commend all of the important initiatives and the ongoing work of the Commission, including the close dialogue that we have now with HERA's upcoming initiatives. And of course, I very much also look forward to collaborating with member states and upcoming EU presidency. So I'm incredibly grateful also for Spain already now having announced that they will keep AMR on the agenda, and you can count on Sweden. We will be here together with you. So thank you everyone for participating. Thank you for the fantastic collaboration with the European Observatory of Health Systems and Policies, and especially, of course, the authors of this report. And thank you for the collaboration with the EU Commission and with WHO also. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to you, Malin and colleagues. Have a nice afternoon.